He was just reading by the pool, sunlight on his skin, a rare day off after years of hard work. The quiet hum of sprinklers and the soft rustle of pages were the only sounds in the air. But peace has a way of shattering when prejudice decides it doesn't belong. The gates creaked open. 2 police cars rolled in, sirens off, but authority loud enough to drown the calm. Within seconds, the air shifted. A simple afternoon turned into a silent trial. The neighbors peeked from behind their blinds, pretending to water their lawns. One of them had called. Said a suspicious man was trespassing. At his own home, they didn't ask who he was. They assumed. His skin was enough of a story for them. Now, with hands trembling under the sun, he tried to stay composed. Every word he'd ever read about survival flashed through his mind. The rules, the caution, the invisible checklist every black man carries when faced with flashing badges. He knew that one wrong move could rewrite his life in headlines. The officers demanded answers, their tone sharp, their eyes sharper. Behind them, the neighbor laughed, the kind of laugh that thrives on fear. But what came next silenced everyone, because this man wasn't who they thought he was. He wasn't just a homeowner. He wasn't just another suspect. What he pulled from his wallet would change everything, a symbol of authority they couldn't challenge. A badge, not of guilt, but of power. And in that split second, the same men who had cornered him would step back speechless. But by then, the damage was already done. This isn't just a story about one man by the pool. It's a story about what happens when power meets prejudice, and how the truth, once revealed, can expose far more than anyone expected. So the question is, when justice finally stood face to face with bias, who really got exposed? It was supposed to be a calm summer morning, the kind of morning that felt like a reward for years of struggle. The sun shimmered over the pool's surface, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and success. For once, Marcus didn't have to chase deadlines or prove himself in another meeting filled with polite disbelief. He'd built everything he had from the ground up, a life many said he'd never reach. His neighbors called this place the quiet side of the city. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, children riding their bikes without worry. It was a picture of peace. But for Marcus, that peace had always come with an asterisk. He'd felt the glances, the kind that lasted a beat too long. The questions disguised as compliments. You live here? Or what kind of work do you do? They never meant harm, or so they claimed. Yet their curiosity was always a reminder that his presence needed to be explained. Still, Marcus refused to let it get to him. He was a federal investigator, a man whose work demanded calm under pressure. He'd faced criminals, corruption, chaos, but nothing quite like the silent suspicion that followed him home. This morning, though, was his escape. He'd traded his badge for a book, his uniform for swim shorts. Reclining by the pool, he felt a rare stillness, a fragile kind of peace that only comes when you stop fighting to prove you belong. The sound of pages turning mixed with distant laughter from a nearby yard. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe he was just another neighbor enjoying his success. But even in that stillness, something lingered, a tension he couldn't name. He caught sight of a curtain shifting across the street, a figure moving behind glass, a phone lifted, a silhouette framed by suspicion. Marcus didn't know it yet, but that single moment, that single glance, had already rewritten his day. Because in a few minutes, the quiet side of the city would no longer be quiet, and the world would once again remind him that, to some people, even success can look suspicious when worn by the wrong skin. The first sign was small and easy to ignore. A curtain lifted across the street, the shape of a phone hovered, and the lens glinted like a tiny eye. Marcus let the page he was reading fall against his chest and listened. The neighborhood always had its morning soundtrack, a mower in the distance, birds scattering from hedge to hedge, the soft hiss of the pool pump doing its work. Today, under that ordinary hush, something new threaded through. It was the feeling of being watched, the kind that tightens the air and makes the body alert even before the mind understands why. He sat up on the lounge chair, the towel slipping from his shoulder to the warm concrete, and scanned the row of manicured hedges that shielded his backyard from the street. A second shape floated behind the neighbor's window, then vanished. The moment stretched. It could have been nothing, he told himself. It often was. Yet experience had trained him to trust the tremor in his chest when it arrived without warning. Patterns mattered. Tiny choices mattered. In high-stakes work and in ordinary life, safety began with paying attention. A dry leaf scratched along the coping, lifted by the faintest breeze. Somewhere a dog barked and fell silent. Marcus laid the book on the side table and eased his feet to the ground. He was supposed to be off duty, invisible to the tug of work, present in his own home. But even peace had become a discipline. He took a long breath and stood, as if to stretch, as if to admire the shimmer of light breaking across the water. He didn't want to look like a man reacting. He wanted to look like a man relaxing. The line between those two roles had become a kind of armor. The sound came before the sight. Rubber rolled over pavement, slow and controlled, an engine humming at a practiced idle. The gate he'd installed for privacy shivered with a heavy clank. The latch clicked once, then again. The gate swung open. Not a chirp of a friendly greeting. Not the casual rhythm of a delivery truck. Authority arrived softly, as it always did in neighborhoods like this, where image mattered as much as action. 2 patrol cars slipped into the driveway, lights off, radios quiet, the presence of power disguised as routine. The first officer stepped out with the measured energy of someone who believed his presence alone was instruction. The second emerged with a notepad already in hand, eyes scanning, posture alert. Behind them, along the sidewalk, another figure paused with folded arms, a smile too wide for the moment. The neighbor from across the street, the phone still in her hand, almost gleeful in its permanence. She had watched him come and go for months, Marcus realized. She had watched and chosen this morning to do more than watch. He felt heat gather behind his eyes, not from the sun, but from the rush of calculations that had saved other men and women in other places. Space, distance, hands, angles, voice, everything mattered. He reminded himself that his only job in this instant was to come home to himself at the end of the day. He was not the case file. He was not the lesson. He was a person who wanted to finish a chapter and maybe grill something later and call his mother before evening. He let his shoulders drop, kept his hands visible, and looked at the officers without flinching. They were already writing a story about him. He could feel it in the shape of their attention. A man by a pool, a body that did not fit their picture of ownership. The house behind him was modern and understated, all clean line and quiet confidence. The mismatch carried its own voltage. The first officer scanned the patio furniture, the glass doors leading into the kitchen, the landscape lighting, the small stone plaque near the gate with his address engraved. The address confirmed nothing in their minds. The story they had brought with them confirmed everything. He thought about the last time he'd felt this exact silence, a roadside stop on a dark highway years ago, long before the badge he carried now. The way fear shapes posture, the way patience can become a form of prayer. He had promised himself after that night that he would never let anger do the talking when safety was at stake. He had also promised himself that if he ever earned enough to change his world, he would not let guilt steal his joy. Both promises tested each other in moments like this. The second officer took a step closer, flipping to a fresh page. Marcus could see the embossing on the notepad cover, the official seal pressed into faux leather. He could also see the small movements that only training reveals. A glance to the dominant hand of the man being observed. A quick check of the waistband. A read of the shoes for hidden tension. This was the dance every black man knew without being taught. The choreography of survival learned from headlines, documentaries, family warnings, and lived history. He kept his breath steady and let the stillness protect him. A third sound joined the morning. Boots on brick. From the side path, the second unit slipped into view, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who believed they were walking into danger. One officer rested a hand near his holster. Another traced the pool's perimeter with his eyes like it was a crime scene. A fourth emerged near the grill as if checking for hidden threats. Marcus felt the layout of his own home weaponized against him. Every object that made his life comfortable became, in their gaze, a possible prop in a narrative of suspicion. He wanted to speak, to name his address, to point to the framed family photos clearly visible inside the living room, to list the years of tax records and mortgage statements and the electrician's invoice he'd argued over last week. But he also knew that speech could be misunderstood. Volume could be misheard as defiance. Explanation could be mistaken for evasion. He remembered training sessions where words had de-escalated impossible rooms. He also remembered the cases where words never had a chance. The line between those outcomes today felt razor thin. The neighbor across the street laughed again, and the sound tipped the air from tense to taunting. It startled a bird from the hedge. The bird shot up and out, a sudden flare of wings against the blue. Marcus watched it go and anchored himself to the image. Freedom was a moving thing. It required momentum. It demanded choices that seemed small and were not small at all. One officer approached the glass doors and peered through. Another circled back to the gate to check the latch. The first officer stopped 6 feet from Marcus and seemed to square the scene in his mind, as if trying to decide what kind of interaction this would be. A question hung unspoken between them. It did not ask for identity. It assumed the lack of it. Marcus answered with nothing but calm eye contact and open hands. He would not perform a panic that wasn't his. The moment stretched long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat. He counted 3 beats, then 4. He pictured the badge in his wallet inside, pictured it in his hand, pictured the way it would change the room. That image carried its own risk. In his work, identity was a tool, not a shield. If he used it like a shield, he could damage the very trust that made the tool useful. He also knew that in the wrong instant, reaching for anything could become a headline. His choices narrowed to a thin path. Remain still, remain human, remain undeniable. A 4th car turned the corner and paused near the curb. A supervisor, maybe? The neighbor's smile faltered just a little at the growing audience. From 2 houses down, another resident emerged with a leash and a concerned expression that was almost a performance. The street had its theater now. Marcus stood on the stage without wanting to. The audience grew by the minute. His phone lay on the table next to his book. The temptation to record pressed heavy on his mind. He had already seen the power of that lens in the neighbor's hand, how a camera can become both witness and weapon. He also knew that reaching for it would invite a response he did not control. He studied the angle of sunlight and the reflection on the screen and decided. He lifted his left hand slowly, palm visible, and nudged the phone toward the edge with 2 fingers until the camera faced upward. He tapped once. The tiny red dot blinked alive. A quiet insurance policy, nothing more. It shouldn't take a lens to earn safety, he thought. It shouldn't take a title to be believed. But this morning was not about what should be. It was about what was. The first question finally came, not as sound, but as posture. The lead officer tilted his head toward the side gate as if asking who else might be here. Marcus answered with an almost imperceptible shake. Alone. He added a small gesture toward the house, then toward himself. Home. He stayed disciplined, offering only what the moment required. The lead officer's eyes narrowed, reading the cues, measuring the risk, calculating the next move. From the corner of his vision, Marcus caught a flash of movement near his kitchen window. The reflection showed a familiar form. The metal badge holder resting near the key tray where he'd tossed it last night out of habit. He thought about the meetings he'd left early this week, the case files lined up on his desk, the names he couldn't say out loud in the sunshine of a backyard. The work did not pause because the world questioned where he sat. The work waited inside the house, silent and patient while the world wrote labels on his skin. A new sound rose and fell, a siren far off, not for this street, but it stole the calm anyway. It turned the morning into something brittle. The supervisor stepped onto the brick path, radio in hand, and the formation adjusted. Positions tightened. Roles formalized. In the neighbor's eyes, something eager sparked, as if the scene had finally become what she hoped it would be. Marcus traced the stone plaque with his eyes again, the engraved address catching light. He remembered the day he'd chosen it. He remembered the installer's quick nod and the way the stone felt cool and heavy in his palm. A reminder that place could be claimed. Today, that stone felt like a statement no one wanted to read. He decided to move. Not fast, not slow. the kind of movement that invited no surprise. He bent at the waist to pick up the towel he'd dropped, lifted it with 2 fingers, shook off a single leaf, and draped it over the chair again. It was nothing. It was everything. The lead officer's hand hovered near his belt, then eased away. Marcus felt the invisible wire between them stretch and hold. He pictured other mornings in other places. The young man in the park, whose presence near a playground had been called in as suspicious. The woman in her own building who had been asked for proof of residence in the lobby she paid to maintain. The professor on his way home whose tote bag had become an object of threat in someone else's imagination. He knew how those stories could turn. He also pictured the people who had reached out to him quietly after those stories broke. People who worked inside systems and wanted them to be better. People who believed in the slow labor of repair. He pictured the trainings he had offered to agencies that requested them. The conversations about bias and posture and de-escalation, the times when the room had softened and something like understanding had replaced defensiveness. He knew change was possible. He also knew it arrived unevenly, like summer storms that drench one street and skip the next. He let those memories put weight in his spine. Standing was a form of testimony. He would not shrink inside his own home. The lead officer gestured, asking for identification. The gesture contained its own trap. The wallet was inside. The distance to the kitchen seemed ordinary until it wasn't. Reaching for anything could be misread. Not reaching could prolong the theater. He scanned the second unit and found the one pair of eyes that seemed less rigid than the others. He inclined his head toward the kitchen, then toward his own chest. Identification inside. He kept his hands spread and waited. For a moment, uncertainty ran through the group like a ripple across the pool. The supervisor murmured something into the radio. The officers adjusted again, one moving toward the kitchen door but stopping short of entering. Marcus stepped backward 3 small steps to show he posed no threat to anyone's definition of safety, then turned slightly so that every motion was in full view. He could feel the camera on his phone witnessing the geometry of the moment. The neighbor across the street lowered her phone and crossed her arms tighter, as if frustrated by the lack of spectacle. A car slowed at the corner to watch. The air grew warmer, or maybe that was just the blood rising beneath his skin. He thought of his mother's voice on Sundays, gentle and unwavering. He thought of the first time he had tried on the suit he wore to his academy graduation, the way the fabric felt like a promise. He thought of the nights he had fallen asleep at his desk with a map of names and connections under his cheek. He thought of the hours of work invisible to strangers, the kind that changed lives without ever being mentioned in the news. He let those thoughts steady him. He lifted a hand and pointed to the kitchen. Then he placed that hand flat against his own sternum, keeping the other hand lifted, fingers extended. Every choice narrated, every move pre-declared. He took 1 step toward the sliding glass door and paused. The lead officer nodded once mechanically. The permission felt less like grace and more like the loosening of a rope you cannot see. Inside, the kitchen gleamed with morning light. The badge holder rested exactly where he'd seen it in the reflection, beside the key tray with the small brass tag engraved with his initials. He did not reach for it yet. He paused at the threshold because he knew the weight of this moment. He knew that revealing the badge too early could be read as arrogance or as a trick. He knew that waiting too long could be read as non-compliance. He knew that either reading could rewrite his story in the wrong direction. He let his palm touch the cool glass of the door and counted to 5. The pool pump hummed steady. The supervisor watched, expression unreadable. The neighbor's gaze burned like a spotlight. The camera on the table recorded the geometry of posture and possibility. He slid the door open with a deliberate motion, stepped inside, and kept his body angled so the officers could observe his hands. He moved to the counter and stopped halfway to show there was no rush in him, no sudden impulse. He reached the key tray and rested his fingers next to the badge without touching it. He wanted to feel the moment believe him before he lifted it. He wanted to ensure the room braced for what it would mean. Memory pressed close again. The case from last winter when a suspect had tried to use a counterfeit credential to avoid a warrant. The way counterfeit power had turned a tense scene volatile in an instant. He understood that the officers outside might hold that same story in their minds now, ready to doubt anything he presented. He would need to make this reveal not just undeniable, but unassailable. The angle, the distance, the clarity of the emblem, the way he would hold it. All of it mattered. He did not lift the badge. Not yet. He turned his attention to the family photos along the wall by the breakfast table. Smiles framed in wood, a graduation cap angled slightly crooked, a younger version of himself beside his mother, pride thick as sunlight, evidence of home that required no explanation and yet often demanded it from people who denied what they saw. He let the images give him strength, then returned to the counter. Outside, a new engine idled at the curb. Another vehicle had arrived, heavier than a patrol car. The sound carried authority that made even the supervisor straighten. The neighbor's smile twitched, unease catching at the corners. A few houses down, someone drew their child back from the sidewalk and closed a gate with exaggerated care. The street held its breath again. Marcus curled his fingers around the badge holder and finally lifted it, not as a flourish, but as a fact. He didn't raise it high. He didn't rush it forward. He kept it at chest level and angled so the emblem was visible through the glass even before he stepped outside. He walked back to the door with the steady patience of a man placing an irrefutable document on a table. At the threshold, he paused again, letting the sunlight catch the seal until it flashed like water. He stepped onto the patio. The officers stiffened, eyes tracking the rectangle in his hand. A dozen assessments flickered across their faces in a second. Doubt, surprise, calculation. The supervisor's radio crackled with a burst of static and then a voice too low to parse. Marcus kept moving until the distance between him and the lead officer felt precise enough to communicate without threat. He stopped. He did not speak. He held the badge so the emblem was clear, the lettering legible, the edges sharp against the morning. He let the silence carry it across the space, a quiet truth sliding into a loud room. He watched the neighbor's expression alter, confusion opening like a crack in stone. He watched one of the officers glance toward the supervisor as if waiting for a new script. For a beat, nothing changed. Authority met authority and found no easy way out. Marcus could feel the old anger knocking at the door of his chest, asking to be let in, asking to be the voice that finally named what this was and why it kept happening. He kept the door closed. Not yet. Not here. The goal was safety first, then meaning, then accountability. He had learned to order those things even when the world tried to mix them into chaos. A drone of distant thunder rumbled. Or maybe it was a truck on the main road beyond the subdivision. It sounded like a warning regardless. He shifted his weight, careful not to look like a man preparing to run or fight, just a man ready to stand longer than anyone expected. The lead officer's jaw tightened as if bracing against the consequences of the room, learning a truth it had not anticipated. In the split second before any response formed, a memory rose unbidden. A briefing room months earlier, a slide projected on a wall, a statistic about calls that start with suspicion and end with apology, far too late to repair the harm done. The facilitator had asked everyone in the room to list the first 3 identities they assigned unconsciously when they entered a scene. He remembered his own answers and the quiet vow he had made to interrogate them, to do better every time. He wondered what answers the men in front of him would give if asked the same. The supervisor took a single step forward, uncertainty flickering at the edge of his eyes. The morning hung above them like a glass that might shatter at the slightest shock. Marcus felt the weight of all the unseen histories leaning over the fence to watch. He held the badge with the calm insistence of fact. He let it speak for him. Then, from the gate, a new figure appeared in a plain polo, moving with the self-assured stride of someone who did not need flashing lights to prove authority. The man glanced from the badge to Marcus, to the supervisor, and then to the neighbor across the street. He carried certainty like a tool. The lead officer inhaled sharply, caught off guard by the arrival. The neighbor's arms loosened as if the scene had slipped from her control. Marcus felt the moment pivot. He did not know yet which way it would turn. The badge weighed warm in his hand. The camera's red dot blinked on the table, recording a truth that demanded to be seen. The pool water whispered against the tile, patience in motion. He understood that everything that came next would reveal more than just his identity. It would expose the reflexes of everyone standing in his backyard and on his street. It would expose whether systems protect dignity or pride. It would expose how quickly power adjusts when it realizes it is facing itself. The plainclothes figure opened his mouth, but Marcus focused on the supervisor, whose fingers tightened around the radio like a lifeline. In another second, the narrative would either fracture or harden. The neighbor's phone lifted again, last attempt at capturing a story she thought she understood. Marcus steadied his breathing and tightened his grip on the badge holder, ready to choose the exact words that would secure safety without surrendering truth, ready to let the weight of his work enter the scene with precision, ready to force the room to see what it had tried not to see from the moment the gate swung open. And just as the first syllable prepared to leave someone's throat, the sound of another engine rose at the curb, a familiar engine, one that did not belong to patrol or supervision. Tires hushed against pavement. Doors opened with a confident click. The temperature of the morning shifted again, as if the sun itself had leaned closer to witness. Marcus lifted the badge a fraction higher, not in defiance but in declaration. The scene held its breath. Everything was about to change. The badge gleamed in his hand, sunlight flashing off the metal like a defiant truth. For a split second, everything stopped. The shouting, the scribbling, the tension in the air, it all froze in place. The scene looked like a photograph of power colliding with prejudice. The lead officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes flicked from the badge to Marcus, back to the badge again, disbelief widening the space between blinks. Behind him, the younger officer lowered his notepad slowly, confusion crawling across his face. They weren't trained for this moment. They were trained to command, to control, to assume. But what do you do when the man you cornered turns out to be everything you claim to protect? The neighbor's smirk evaporated, replaced by something more fragile, embarrassment, maybe even fear. Her hand, once proud and steady with the phone, now trembled. The lens that had captured what she thought was a criminal now recorded her own humiliation. Marcus didn't move. He didn't gloat, didn't shout, didn't even breathe too deeply. Every muscle in his body stayed locked, waiting to see if recognition would register, if justice would remember his name before judgment claimed it again. Finally, the supervisor stepped forward, his boots crunching against the brick like the slow tick of a clock. He stopped 3 feet away, gaze locked on the badge. The gold seal caught the sunlight again and his jaw tensed. "Federal agent," it read, unmistakable, unchallengeable. A ripple ran through the officers. Postures shifted. Eyes darted. The lead officer took a half step back, as if physical distance might undo the damage already done. His voice cracked when he finally spoke, an awkward apology wrapped in authority. But Marcus didn't hear it. His mind was somewhere else entirely, in the years that built this moment. The unspoken truth that no badge, no title, no success could shield him from suspicion born of skin, because before they saw his authority, they saw his color. Before they respected his role, they feared his presence. The irony stung. He had trained officers just like them, lectured about implicit bias, built programs to prevent exactly this kind of encounter. And now here he was, standing in his own backyard, treated as a trespasser by the same system he had worked to make fairer. The silence turned heavier than words could carry. Even the pool water seemed still, the world holding its breath as if waiting for someone to admit what this really was. The supervisor murmured something into his radio, calling off the backup, his tone quiet, professional, like an embarrassed cover-up already beginning. But Marcus wasn't just going to let it fade into paperwork and regret. Not this time. He raised the badge higher, steady and deliberate. "This," he said, his voice low but sharp, "is who I am." And then softer, "But before you saw this, you decided who I was." The words weren't loud, but they carried, slicing through the thick summer air like truth breaking through denial. The young officer's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his notebook clutched like a lifeline. The older one couldn't meet Marcus's eyes anymore. The neighbor looked down, suddenly interested in the cracks of her sidewalk. For years, Marcus had built his life around being exceptional. the one who proved stereotypes wrong. But standing there, he felt the weight of something darker. The realization that no amount of excellence could erase the lens through which others chose to see him. The supervisor began mumbling about misunderstanding, about routine checks, about how someone had called. Marcus let him talk. Let the excuses pile up like weak bricks in a collapsing wall. He'd heard them before, in newsrooms, in courtrooms, in classrooms, the language of denial that tries to sound like reason. He stepped closer, each movement calm but electric. "You know what the difference is between this and the cases you read about?" he said quietly, eyes fixed on the lead officer. "It's that I lived." The sentence hung there, uncomfortably long. No one breathed, because everyone in that yard, the officers, the neighbor, even Marcus himself, knew how easily that line could have been rewritten into a tragedy. One misunderstanding, one twitch, one louder word, and he wouldn't have been a man reading a book by his pool. He'd have been another name trending for all the wrong reasons. He thought of the countless others who hadn't had a badge to flash, men whose stories ended before their truth was believed. The thought burned through him, grief and fury indistinguishable. The neighbor finally spoke, voice trembling. I didn't mean—" Marcus didn't even turn. He didn't need to hear her apology, because the damage wasn't just hers. It belonged to an entire system of reflexes and fears, learned and rehearsed until they felt natural. The supervisor offered a handshake. Marcus looked at it but didn't take it. Some things couldn't be smoothed over with formality. He simply said, "Next time, don't let it come to this," and turned away, back toward the pool, back to the place where this all began. As he walked, the sound of boots shifting behind him filled the silence, slow, awkward, retreating. The officers exited the gate one by one, the neighbor still standing frozen as the last car reversed down the street. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving behind a neighborhood that suddenly felt smaller, exposed, stripped of its illusion of innocence. Marcus sat back on his lounge chair. The book he'd been reading was still there, pages fluttering from the breeze caused by all the movement, the irony of it cruel and beautiful. He picked it up, marked the page with a slow breath, and looked at the reflection of the badge in the pool water. The two symbols, one of peace, one of authority, wavered together under the sunlight, distorted by the ripples. He realized that his entire life existed somewhere between them, the fragile balance between calm and confrontation, between belonging and being mistaken for a threat. His phone buzzed on the table. The video, the one he had started recording before the officers arrived, was still running. Every second of what happened was captured, the approach, the demands, the silence, the laughter, and finally, the truth. He stared at the blinking red light and thought, maybe this time someone needed to see it. Maybe this time silence wasn't safety, maybe it was complicity. As he reached for the phone, his hand paused. He could post it. He could expose them, make headlines, force accountability. But he also knew what would follow, the noise, the backlash, the questioning of motives. Yet another story reduced to debate instead of change. The water shimmered, reflecting both the badge and the sky. Two kinds of power, one given, one infinite. He didn't know which one to trust anymore. A soft wind brushed past, carrying the faint echo of sirens somewhere far away. He looked up at the sky and wondered, how many more would have to flash proof of worth before the world simply believed in their humanity? He set the phone down gently beside him, still recording, still blinking, because maybe the real exposure wasn't his to control anymore. Maybe the truth had already spoken loud enough, and as the final car disappeared from view, Marcus whispered to himself, not in anger, not in victory, but in quiet defiance. They thought they saw a threat, but what they really saw was a mirror. The screen fades to black, the water still rippling, the badge gleaming, leaving the question hanging in silence. When the system fears its own reflection, who will it protect next time? The next morning, the pool looked the same, clear, still, unbothered by the chaos it had witnessed. But Marcus wasn't the same. Sleep had barely visited. His mind replayed the scene over and over, the sirens that never wailed but still screamed, the hands that hovered near holsters, the eyes that saw threat where there was none. He sat at the kitchen table, badge beside his coffee, the video from his phone still open on the screen. Every frame was a reminder, calm voice, measured movements, restraint in the face of insult. The kind of self-control expected only from those forced to prove they deserved to live. He'd thought his badge gave him distance from that reality. Now he knew it never truly could. Outside, life went on. Lawnmowers buzzed. Kids laughed. The same neighbor who had called the police hurried to her car, head down, pretending she didn't see him. Pretending yesterday didn't happen. But it did, and Marcus wasn't going to bury it. Not this time. He hit save, then send. The video went to Internal Affairs and later, quietly, to a journalist he trusted. Days turned into weeks. The story spread like ripples across the pool. It wasn't the first video of racial profiling, but it was different. This time, the suspect wasn't powerless. He had authority, credentials, and a platform that couldn't be ignored. The footage sparked debates on every news channel, every social feed. Commentators dissected every second. Why were they called in the first place? Would they have entered his yard if he looked different? The department released a statement, the usual blend of apology and excuse. The officers were placed on leave pending review, but Marcus knew the investigation wasn't the victory. The victory was the conversation that followed, uncomfortable, raw, necessary. He was invited to speak publicly about the incident. At first he hesitated. He wasn't sure if he wanted to relive it, to turn his pain into another case study for empathy. But when he saw the messages, hundreds from strangers, thousands from young men who saw themselves in him, he realized silence was no longer an option. At the community forum, the room fell quiet when he spoke. No uniform, no badge, just a man stripped of illusion, standing in truth. "I've spent my career teaching officers to de-escalate," he said, voice steady. "But what no one teaches is how it feels when your existence is treated as escalation." He paused, scanning faces, some ashamed, some moved, some defensive. "That day I had something that saved me. A badge, a camera. But what about the ones who don't? The ones who don't get to explain, don't get to live long enough to prove they belong?" The silence afterward was heavier than applause could ever be, because everyone in that room knew he was right. Weeks later, the neighbor knocked on his door. She stood small on his porch, voice trembling. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought you were someone else." Marcus didn't respond right away. The words hung there, echoing the same broken logic he'd heard his whole life. Someone else. He looked at her, not with anger, but with exhaustion. "That's the problem," he finally said. "You didn't think I could be me?" She lowered her head and left without another word. Months passed, and Marcus returned to his work. But something in him had shifted. He no longer saw his position as protection. He saw it as purpose. He pushed for reforms that hit closer to home: anonymous call verification, neighborhood bias training, accountability clauses. Some colleagues resisted, others stood beside him. Change, he knew, was never fast. But it was impossible without friction. He became the voice he once wished existed, one that didn't just condemn the system but worked to rebuild it. His name began to appear in articles about reform and resilience, often under headlines like "The Agent Who Turned His Own Trauma into Change." Yet every time he read those words, he felt the same ache, because he shouldn't have had to. He shouldn't have had to earn the right to peace in his own backyard. One night, months after the incident, Marcus walked out to the pool again. The water reflected the stars, soft and endless. He sat at the edge, feet dipping into the cool surface. The same place where everything had unraveled now felt like a mirror of what he'd rebuilt. The badge lay on the table behind him, catching faint moonlight. He didn't need it to feel safe anymore, though he still wasn't sure what safety meant. Maybe it wasn't absence of danger. Maybe it was presence of truth. He thought of the people who had written to him. Fathers teaching their sons to stay calm. Mothers fearing the walk home for their kids. Young men tired of being seen as warnings instead of neighbors. Their words stayed with him, a collective heartbeat echoing across thousands of lives that shared the same story under different names. He realized this wasn't about his pool, his neighborhood, or his career. It was about every moment the world demanded proof of humanity before. Granting respect, he picked up his phone and opened the message draft he'd been rewriting. For weeks, the one he planned to post with the full video, unedited. He read it again slowly. This isn't about me. It's about what happens when fear wears a uniform and bias holds the pen that writes our stories. If you watched this and felt uncomfortable, good. That means you still have empathy left to change what's broken. He stared at it, thumb hovering over post. Then he pressed send. The video resurfaced, this time not as an incident, but as a movement. It wasn't just watched. It was studied, shared, discussed in classrooms, churches, and training rooms. It became proof that silence protects systems, not people. Marcus began traveling, speaking at academies, universities, and conferences. He didn't talk about blame. He talked about blindness, how it hides behind policy, habit, and privilege. His message was simple but searing. You can't fix what you refuse to see. And slowly, people began to see. But fame wasn't what he wanted. What mattered were the small changes. An officer who called him months later, saying the story changed how he approached his next stop. A mother who said she'd stopped being afraid every time her son left home. Not because the world had changed, but because she knew people like Marcus were fighting to make it. Still, some nights he woke up to the echo of that morning, the sound of tires on gravel, the click of a gate, the suffocating silence before recognition. It was a memory branded deep, a scar that would never fade. But even scars have stories, and his wasn't one of defeat. It was a reminder that even in a world built to misunderstand you, you can still define yourself. 1 year later, a memorial event was held for victims of racial profiling. Marcus stood quietly among the crowd, not as a guest of honor, not as a speaker, just as another black man who understood the weight of survival. Names were read aloud, candles lit, tears shed. He looked at the flickering lights, each one representing a life that didn't get the chance to flash a badge, a phone, or even a voice. And for a moment, he wondered, why did it take power to prove innocence? He thought of his badge again, how it had once felt like armor. But armor, he realized, doesn't make you safe. It just hides the wound long enough for others to pretend it isn't there. When the ceremony ended, a little boy approached him, maybe 10 years old, nervous but determined. "My dad said you're a real agent," the boy said. "He told me you helped people." Marcus smiled softly. "I try." The boy hesitated, then asked, "Did they say sorry to you?" Marcus paused, glancing at the candlelight trembling in the wind. "Some did," he said. "But saying sorry isn't enough. You have to change what you're sorry for." The boy nodded, too young to understand, but wise enough to listen. Later that night, Marcus returned home. The pool lights glowed a pale blue, calm and endless. He sat beside the water again, just like that first day. But this time, the silence felt earned, not imposed. He thought about everything that had happened. The humiliation, the anger, the aftermath. It had broken something in him, yes, but it had also built something new. Purpose, conviction, a voice louder than his fear. He closed his eyes and exhaled. The world outside hadn't changed completely, but he had. And sometimes that's where revolutions begin. Not with riots, but with realization. He whispered into the night, not for anyone to hear, but because the truth needed sound. "I didn't win because they backed away. I won because I didn't." His story became a lesson, a warning and a mirror for every officer who wears a badge, for every neighbor who picks up a phone, for every person who still believes equality is a given instead of a fight. And as his voice echoed through screens across the country, it carried one question, a question that refused to fade even after the video ended. How many more have to prove they belong before the world finally believes they do? The screen fades out slowly. A single line appears. He was not the first. He will not be the last. But maybe, if enough of us start seeing, he can be the last one who had to prove it. Then silence.